What's up, man?
Hey Bronson, how you doing?
I'm Squall. Well, not really.
Man, it's almost it's 8:10 here in Sacramento. You're in Hawaii, I think.
Yeah, 5:10 p.m.
Hmm.
So the American Civil War was about secession. You disagree?
Yeah, I do. I mean, obviously there was seceding, but I think it was clearly the purpose of it was slavery, and I think you can see that if you look at their documents. But I'd be interested to see what do you have any position on how you come to the conclusion that it was primarily about states' rights rather than slavery?
Well, no, that's not my view at all. So, well, I guess my position is straightforward and simple. I accept the fact that the state seceded primarily because of slavery. You know, that's just the fact. I don't know how anyone would dispute that. What my simple observation is that we can see, okay, how many slave states were there? 15. How many of them seceded? 11. How many were invaded? 11, not 15. So it seems to me that secession seems to be it makes more accurate predictions, I'll say, than slavery. Slavery is 11 out of 15, so that's 73% accuracy, whereas secession theory is 11 out of 11, so it's 100% accuracy. When we look at which states actually went to war or were invaded, it happens to be all the secession states and not all the slave states.
So when you say that 11 were invaded, which were the 4 that were not invaded?
Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, maybe Missouri. I don't know I forget what the 4th is. But,
so primarily ones that would have been easy to occupy immediately.
Well, they were occupied. They stayed in the Union, so
right.
They were, yeah. Okay. And they continued to practice slavery before, during, and even after the war. They were still practicing slavery. So it seems to me that secession was probably the greater cause. I would make another point, which is that if we can look to the South's stated reason for secession, and I'm accepting that as fact, I'll take that evidence, of course. But why shouldn't we look to the North's stated reasons? Why shouldn't we look to what President Lincoln said about why we have to go to war? He was pretty clear on the issue. It was not a war to free slaves. It was a war to preserve the Union.
Okay. So in response to that, you essentially have 2 points. You have that it was about secession, not slavery, and your explanation for that is that there were 11 states versus the 15 states. 11 of which were slaveholding, and the 15 of which were slaveholding, but only 11 of which were invaded.
Yeah.
So, okay. And then the second argument there, if I'm hearing it right, would be that we have to look to the North's reasons for the Civil War as well. Like, for instance, Abraham Lincoln, who said that they were fighting the war to preserve the Union, not necessarily because of slavery. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So my response to both of those is that you have to look at the primary cause of the war. In order to do that, you can look at the positions of both the North and the South. So let me first look at the South, because I think we'll both agree on this, but I think it's important to understand in context what it was that was being said. And you can look at each of their statements of secession for why they were seceding. For instance, Mississippi.
Well, real quickly, is it relevant given that it's not a subject of dispute? Like,
it is relevant because it establishes the context for why the North would then respond. So Mississippi said,
I mean, can we just say that they seceded for slavery?
Can we say what?
Can we just say that they seceded because they wanted to keep slaves?
I think you can say that, yeah. And
okay,
every single one of them would have said this, and they did say this. So if
I agree.
Read the quotes if you're going to agree with the quotes and everything, but each of them, in more or less racist terms, absolutely did say that slavery was the reason why they were seceding. So then the question is, I
don't dispute that.
Okay, you don't dispute that. Excellent. So the question is, would the North have stepped in if this was a minor issue, or would they only have stepped in if this was a major issue? And the answer is the second. And you can actually see this because you can look at the positions of the North at the time. So you can look at different quotes, like, for instance, the New York Times said March 21, 1861, there is growing sentiment throughout the North in favor of letting the Gulf states go. You can also look at the original perceptions in the Constitution, which was that the states believed that they had the right to leave. They would not have signed those documents had they not believed they had the right to secede, even to accept the Constitution. So
it was a common view.
It was a common view. Yeah, it was well agreed that states had the right to secede. So,
well, there wasn't agreement. I mean, if you read the Federalist Papers and things like that, there were, people had different positions. Some said, yeah, Jefferson and the Jeffersonians would say, yeah, they can secede. But then, the Hamiltonians and those people would have said, no, you can't secede. So, I mean, there was disagreement, obviously.
Right, so there was disagreement. But had there been a minor issue, then the growing sentiments that we have seen most likely would have caused it not to be an issue. However, since each of the states were so focused on slavery, it became the primary cause. And you do see that when you look at the responses that the North was giving. That's the reason why the North ended up stepping in. Now, the North might not necessarily have been all the good guys. They weren't necessarily fighting just to save slaves. However, that was the primary reason for stopping the South, as opposed to stopping any other form of secession. So we know that secession was something that was, it was contested and everything, but it was something that was generally agreed that the Southern states had the right to do. However, because slavery was such a massive issue, that's why the North stepped in with regards to the Civil
Well,
War.
that's factually inaccurate. It was not generally agreed. The North's position was that they don't have a right to secede, and that's why the war ensued. I mean, that was the disagreement.
Okay. So, I mean, we can go back and forth about who said what and who believed what, but I think we both agree that there was a point of contention both in the North, and even though in the South it was majority agreed, but even in the North it was disagreed. There was a lot of contention on, do states have the right to secede? So,
hang on a second. The same could be said about the South. I mean, there were many Unionists in the South. There was some disagreement there,
but each of them did to succeed.
Sure, right.
So overall, they did agree that they were going to secede. The North, on the contrary, if you look at the history of it, the question was who would be elected president. And many of those in the South said, we will secede if Abraham Lincoln is elected. He was then elected. At that point, it then became a question of, will the North step in or won't they? And the reason the South wanted to secede was because they were worried about Lincoln taking away their slaves. The election of Lincoln was a first step that caused the South to pull away. And you see this in their documents. Would you like me to read a quote about that?
No, we're not disputing that.
Okay.
I agree that the South seceded mostly for slavery.
So the South did it for slavery, and the North had two reasons really to defend it. And when we say the North, we can't just say Lincoln. We mean overall in general. What was it that made the political opinions of the time be strong enough for Lincoln to actually be able to do this? And the answer is that they ended up focusing on slavery. Because it was such an important issue to the people in the North, they were able to get this through. Now, if you could show, here would actually be the standard that you could do to show opposite. If you could show that the vast majority of people at the time in the North were entirely focused on states' rights or on secession, then you could make the stance you're saying. Can you show that?
Well, not entirely, but majority, yes. The radical Republicans didn't take power until after Lincoln died and during Reconstruction, so they clearly weren't a majority.
Okay. Well, okay, so how do you come to the conclusion then that the entire reason the North was stopping the South was because of secession? Well, how do you come to the conclusion that slavery was not a majority reason in that?
Well, I just looked to their stated reasons.
Okay, can you read some of those?
Well, you can. Well, I don't have anything. I'm just using my phone. But if you go Google Lincoln's quotes on the matter, he said, if my goal here is to preserve the Union, I would do that if I could free 0 slaves and do that, I would do it. If I could free all the slaves and do it, I would do it. But ultimately, the goal is to preserve the Union. So it's a well-known quote.
Yeah, I agree. I mentioned that earlier. But that doesn't mean that the North's entire reason to stop the South was secession. That just means that Abraham Lincoln was focused primarily on stopping the Southern states from seceding. But the reason the Southern states were seceding was because of slavery.
Well, I mean, you can also look to the debates that were being had in Congress. There's a reason Lincoln had to walk that fine line between basically pretending not to be an abolitionist, even though he was. And the reason for that is because it was not the political majority opinion. You know, there were people who thought, well, you know, the South never would have agreed to be under the Constitution without slaves. Slavery is explicitly protected by the Constitution.
Well, that's interesting.
So,
I got to interrupt you for a moment there, because you said that Abraham Lincoln was an abolitionist. So I think that you actually have agreed with me here in that you're saying that they were walking a line, that Lincoln was walking a line and that he had to say the right things. But if he was an abolitionist at heart, what you are saying is that his ultimate goal was to stop slavery. Do you disagree with that?
It's not, but you can't say that he would have went to war over it.
Why not?
You know, yeah, okay, if he could wave a magic wand and free the slaves, sure, but I don't think it's likely he would have went to war.
Well, okay, so you're assuming then that the North was the first to make a move with regards to these issues. However, that's incorrect, because the South was the ones who were specifically seceding. It was you get there? All right.
Yeah.
It was the election of Lincoln that set the events in motion that caused the South to secede. Each and every one of them said that the reason they were seceding was because of slavery. The reason that the election of Lincoln set these events in motion is because they were afraid that Abraham Lincoln, who, as you just pointed out, was an abolitionist at heart, they were worried he would take away their slaves. So whether you're looking at it from the North or the South, ultimately, slavery was the root cause of the issue. It was the primary cause of the American Civil War.
Well, no, because the slave states were never invaded.
Okay, so we're coming back to that. Now, you said that the states that weren't invaded were they were northern slaveholding states, right? Okay.
Well, border states, but yeah.
Sure, and they were allied with the North, right?
Yeah.
So if your goal in a war is to stop an overall concept, you don't invade your allies on that issue. So these northern slaveholding states, while
right, if your goal is to preserve the Union rather than freeing slaves,
even if your goal is to free the slaves, you still don't hurt your allies. And what you then see at the end of the war is Lincoln passes the executive order to free the slaves, whether in the North or the South. That is not something that has anything to do with the secession.
Historically inaccurate.
Okay, well, point it out for me. What did I miss?
Union slave states were specifically excluded in the Emancipation Proclamation. Go read it.
That's interesting. Can you point me to that point? Where is that in the Emancipation Proclamation?
You'll have to Google it, but it's just a fact.
I'm gonna go look at that right now.
Just take my word for it. I mean, it is a fact. I mean, you can look it up later, but the slave states were specifically excluded from, or the Union slave states were specifically excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation, which leads me to believe that it wasn't about freeing the slaves, it was about preserving the Union. As the war drug on in the favor of the Union, then sentiments began to change and say, oh, okay, well, we won the war, we can do whatever the fuck we want, basically.
Okay, well, that's interesting, and I'll look at that later on. But part of that would have to do with what is the most rational response. Now that we have won a war, do we want to alienate our allies? What do we want to do with that? And so they move on with the decision to do what they think is politically expedient in order to benefit the most amount of those who are slaves. So
no, the purpose of So the purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation was to keep Great Britain and France out of the war. It was perceived as a threat at the time that they could intervene on behalf of the South. But they were doing a lot of trade with the North too. That's why it, 90% of their trade was with the North. So they had a good reason not to intervene, but
And
things could have changed.
Britain and France and other European nations had a vested interest in investing in the South was because of the economic trade that was going back and forth between the two. That economic trade was entirely dependent upon the slave trade. So see, this is the thing that I always find when I have these discussions with people, is that ultimately everything did tie back to slavery. The reason that the South left, the reason that the North wound up doing anything was ultimately because of the slave trade.
No, because then I have to look at, okay, what if some state seceded for some other reason? Let's say they didn't want to pay taxes anymore, or they didn't like some tariff or whatever. Oh, it seems likely to me that they would have been invaded too for that reason.
Well, sure, but that's what I was saying at the beginning. That's why the first things I was reading were quotes from people who were saying that it was accepted at the time, or that there was growing appreciation of the acceptance of it at the time. Now, we don't know because it never actually happened. However, the fact that it was such a hot button issue, slavery, is what would cause people to get behind the North's, even if you want to call it a war of aggression, but because it was such a hot button issue, that was what gave them the political capital to be able to do so in the first place. See how that works?
Yeah, but that's not true. The Union cause was, in fact, union. It was unionism.
I mean, I don't disagree that was a huge reason for it. However, the question is, what was the primary cause? And the primary cause, historically, has to have been slavery, because that's what the reason why the South seceded in the first place was slavery.
That was their reason for seceding, but also the North's reason for going to war was to preserve the Union. So we can't just only take one side, one stated reason, and not just ignore the other stated reason.
Sure, I agree. Both of them had reasons. But the states' rights, or secession, was simply an excuse from the Southern side of how they had the rights to go about this. But it wasn't the purpose in any way. When it comes to the North, it's kind of in between. I would agree with that. They were doing it to preserve the Union, but the reason they had to preserve the Union was because the South was seceding over slavery. And ultimately, I think the funny thing is we're ultimately just going to come down to semantics here, but the semantics ultimately do come down to the root issue, which was the South left specifically because of slavery, and the North tried to stop them for two reasons. And we were both advocating one of them, but both of those reasons that the North was focusing on it were important issues.
The second was not the reason, though. Like, if Lincoln had said we're going to war to free the slaves, that would not have enjoyed popular support, first of all. No, the Union Army was not, people weren't going to go sacrifice their lives to free the slaves. I'm sorry, but that's just not true, and we need to accept the fact that their cause was preserving the Union. It's much like, think about the revolution, the American Revolution. You had people who supported the British cause. There was many people who supported the British cause and fought for the British because they genuinely believed in unionism and being a part of their mother country.
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think that you see both sides when you're looking at what the North was doing. And obviously they did want to preserve the Union, but this is where it comes back to semantics. Why did they have to preserve the Union? The whole reason for that was
they just didn't have to. They just believed it.
They just believed it. But they wouldn't have had just believing you have to preserve the Union doesn't mean anything. There's nothing there. There would be no need to do anything about that unless there had been a previous action. And in this case, the previous action was the South having seceded specifically because of slavery.
Okay, but if they seceded for any reason, they probably would have been invaded too, because that still is the stated reason, is preserving the Union.
Yeah, well, you're saying that, but we don't know that. And that's why, look at the quotes.
It's a reasonable assumption. We can look to historical examples like, for example, the nullification crisis. As it happens, we have a historical example of South Carolina basically doing the same shit, deciding they didn't think the federal government had the power to tell them what to do. In this case, it wasn't slavery; it was some tariff that they called the Tariff of Abominations. At the time, President Andrew Jackson, a slave owner from the South, but a very staunch unionist, right? So he was very, very pro-union. He did not believe in any way that any state had any kind of right to secede. And so the South Carolina legislature basically said they weren't going to pay the tariff, and that they just weren't going to follow federal law. And so this went to Congress. President Jackson was going to invade South Carolina. He was going to march an army down there and invade South Carolina because they weren't, they decided they didn't want to be part of the Union or whatever. The only reason this crisis was ever averted is because it went to Congress. And also at the time, Jackson's vice president was John C. Calhoun, who was from South Carolina. I think he ended up resigning over this, and Jackson infamously said that his only regret as president was not shooting John C. Calhoun. So what happened is that Congress basically, South Carolina told the federal government to go fuck themselves. Jackson's response was that, okay, we're going to come invade your state. And then Congress, in order to avert a war of that nature, they didn't fully repeal the tariff, but they dropped it down to an amount that like South Carolina was okay with, I guess, and so the crisis was averted. But we do have a historical example of the federal government willing to go to war over a state seceding for a non-slavery reason.
Sure, I think that makes sense. I think that you could definitely point to different times when the federal government has made acceptances or modifications to laws to appease individual states. And part of the reason for that would be to prevent them from leaving the Union. But in order for your statement and your stance to be correct, you would have to show that in 100% of the circumstances, any state trying to secede would have led to a military action from the remainder of the Union. And I don't think that you can show that. You can show that that's possible, but you certainly can't show that that is necessarily 100% accurate, since there are a lot of people who actually have the stance that it is perfectly acceptable, both whether you were in the North or the South. Even at the time when the founders were creating the Constitution, there were, as you yourself agreed, there was dissent on this issue, that there was an idea that states should have the right to secede. So there was clearly, if the issue had been small enough, like maybe they were dissenting over an increased amount of regulation.
A tariff? Maybe a tariff?
But that's different. That's what they ended up doing there, was modifying the law. There was not necessarily an aggression there. And there was no actual war over it. That's what we're saying here. We don't know what exactly would have happened, but the question is, what was this specific war? And this specific war was focused on slavery.
If South Carolina seceded from the Union because they didn't want to pay a tariff, is it your position that the federal government would have just said, okay, sure?
In that circumstance, I don't really know. It depends on the time. It depends on the issue itself. And honestly, I don't know enough about that specific issue to know what would have happened. My stance is simply that there are things that a state could have done to secede without aggression or military action. Do you think 100% of the time, any state that tried to succeed or tries to succeed today will receive military action stopping them?
Yes, I do.
100% of the time. What is your evidence to say that that is 100%?
Well, all the evidence shows that every state that has tried to secede was in fact invaded. So,
I mean, that happened once. The Civil War was the only time that's actually happened. The only other time that you pointed to when we had even a question of it it was resolved without military action. So even your own example doesn't show that.
Well, because they didn't secede.
Right, exactly. But there was no need for it. So we don't have enough evidence for you to be able to come to the conclusion that you have made here. In order to reach your conclusion, there would have to be multiple times when we have seen states say, I am seceding, and then the other states, the other remainder of the Union, would respond by saying, you can't do that. If you do, you will receive military action. If this has happened a significant amount of times, then we could say to a reasonable degree of certainty that, yes, whenever this happens, the secession would be the primary cause. But unless that is shown by you, it must be presumed that the reason why the Civil War specifically it created and invoked military action was because of what was being fought about, which was slavery.
Well, no, I think we can use our reason and logic and say, okay, would the federal government actually allow a state to secede? I mean, do you believe that?
If the issue was small enough, absolutely, yeah. I mean, let me use a current example. Today, it is actually illegal to secede. After the Civil War, it was outlawed, and it is no longer able to happen. I think it was Scalia has actually written about how no state would have the authority to secede today. And yet,
Texas first white.
California and Texas are both saying, oh, we're going to do it, which probably won't happen, and who knows what will actually happen there. But the point is, no one is advocating military results in reaction to that. It seems to be a more of a legal discussion of, do you have a right to or not? It's not a military discussion of, if you do, we will get you. And so that just goes to show that this is something that's sort of in the overall idea of America, that there's a dissent on whether or not someone has the right to secede, but the idea of military response to that secession is a very different one. And that's what you're trying to say the issue is.
Well, yeah, that is the thing, because, yeah, some activists in California or Texas can talk about seceding, but, you know, the federal government doesn't take that as a serious threat of secession. So that's why there's no military response. If it actually became a real thing that was really going to happen, that's when you would see military response. You know, I mean, it may not even come to that. They may just arrest the legislature or the governor or something like that. But, you know, if secession really did happen, it would be civil war.
So ultimately, there's no way to really know for sure. There really isn't.
Well, there's reasonable and then unreasonable, in my opinion.
So what would a reasonable reason for secession be? If someone had a reasonable reason for let's say the early 1800s, and somebody has a reason for secession, which you would consider reasonable, what would it be?
Can I stop you? Because when I said reasonable, I'm talking about, is it reasonable to presume that the federal government would allow a state to secede? In my view, no. It's simply not in the U.S. government's interest to allow states to secede, so they won't do it.
So, I mean,
let's get back to your question, though. For me, it seems entirely reasonable to secede for any reason. Well, particularly, like, let's say you just don't agree with the federal government for whatever reason. You just don't want to be a part of the union. In any case, the federal response to that will be to prevent you from doing that through any means necessary.
Well, we could go on a tangent here about what a reasonable reason for secession would be, but slavery would not be a reasonable reason for secession. And I think that, would you agree with me on that? That if a state specifically said, I will leave or let's say that there is no such thing as states. Let's say we're all one big country and there's no states, it's just one country. If a segment of that nation said, I am leaving that nation because I want to enslave human beings, would you consider that acceptable?
No.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. And I think that that's ultimately the issue that wound up happening with regards to the Civil War, because the abolitionists, of which Lincoln was sort of I don't know, say he's a closet abolitionist, because I mean, that gets into other questions of him.
That's accurate, I'd say.
Yeah, he was. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that essentially he was. But that's the reason then why the South was worried that the election of Lincoln would cause such a problem. And then had they been pushing for something else, I don't think there's any way of us specifically knowing what would have happened. But we do know that on the issue of slavery, the North did end up taking action against them. That's all that we really know in this instance.
No, they took action against secession, not slavery.
They took action against secession that was made in the name of slavery. It's semantics. We're just going back and forth with semantics.
No, it's still secession because if for what you're saying to be true, the Union slave states would also have to have been invaded, which they were not.
There's a difference because the Union slave states, while still doing something that is obviously bad, they were still working with the overall Union. So I agree with you that there were two goals that the Union was balancing there, and
one was more important than the other, obviously.
Not necessarily. No, they still had the war.
They free the slaves in the Union states. It doesn't make sense.
Those slaves were eventually freed, though, right?
Well, after the war was over, sure.
But that tells you that the whole point was this overall goal. Even if you take a different road to get to that goal, I mean, like for instance, Lincoln. Let's come back to Lincoln here. Lincoln said, and we both have agreed that his real reason for fighting the war was to free the slaves, even though.
No, hang on. That wasn't his real reason for fighting the war. It is true that he was an abolitionist,
right.
But I think it is safe to say that his goal was to preserve the Union.
Okay.
I mean, what president would want half of his country to, who would want to preside over that?
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. But let me rephrase that then. I think that it's clear that Lincoln, his goal in the long term was the freedom of the slaves. And in the short term, his means of getting there was this war, the Civil War, of preventing the South from seceding. In the same way, you actually see the same thing with the South. In the long term, their goal was to preserve the institution of slavery. In the short term, their means of getting there was seceding from the Union, which they believed was the only way they would be able to preserve that institution. So ultimately, both groups had the same goal in mind. It might have been a long-term goal, and you're right that the short-term goal was secession, but the overall primary cause was the institution of slavery.
But it wasn't. It wasn't from the Northern perspective, from the Union perspective. The cause, the one that people were fighting and dying for, was preserving the Union. That's why you had people from the South. Families were split up. You could even be brother and sister, cousins, uncle, father and son. People felt very strongly about preserving the Union, and they weren't joining the Northern cause. They weren't coming from Alabama to go join up with the Union Army to free the slaves. I mean, that's just historically inaccurate. It's not correct.
Do you think that the South's primary cause for the Civil War was slavery?
Oh, yeah, we've already said that. So
okay. So the North is half and half, or even if you're right. Okay, what percentage would you say the North is? What percentage of is it 7-3? Is it 10-0? What was the focus of the North, would you say?
Well, the primary focus was preserving the Union. I mean, you did have abolitionists, obviously, but the radical Republicans were not a majority then. So that tells us what the popular sentiment was. If it was in fact freeing the slaves, then the radical Republicans would have been in office at that time, but they weren't. They only took power after. And so, yeah, after the war goes in your favor, then you can do whatever you want. You can pass the policies that you want. Public opinion changes. Now that we won the war, let's free the slaves. But at the time, when the war actually commenced, the cause was in fact unionism. That's why they were going to war. They wanted to prevent the South from seceding. That's why the slave states were not invaded. That's why none of those slaves were freed. Even after the war was over, they were not freed. It took some time, and then they later freed them. So that tells me it wasn't about slavery, because they could have freed those slaves at any point.
but they still had to work with what was politically expedient because those are the states that had been on their side. So they still were supposed to be giving things to those states. So, I mean, I understand what you're saying, that if slavery was the North's only primary goal, they should have focused on it in their states as well. I understand where you're going with that. That does make sense. However, I think that there are three perspectives that are here. There's the Southern perspective, which is almost entirely slavery. It was the primary perspective and primary cause. There's the
I agree that this was primary
in the South. Yeah, I know. But what I was going with that was,
when you bring up abolition in the North, that would be like me bringing up tariffs and taxes in the South, you know, or states' rights. Like, yeah, those were also mentioned too, but I'm not going to just sit here and pretend like, you know, they weren't seceding for slavery. So I don't understand why you're not just ceding the fact that the Union just wanted to preserve the Union. Yeah, there also were abolitionists too, but they for sure was not the majority sentiment. We know that. We can just look at the makeup of Congress. We can see what President Lincoln said. You can see what the states themselves had to say on the matter.
But that's different though, because the long-term goal, as we have talked about, the long-term goal, which ended up coming into fruition, we know this, the slaves were eventually freed as part of the long-term goal. So sure, maybe the short-term goal was secession, but I'm not going to cede the idea that the North was entirely doing it about secession. But anyway, where I was going with this was there are
war. So let's talk about just the war, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the North stated reason. I mean, it's very clear. Like, if I can say that the South stated reason is slavery, surely you can say the North stated reason was preserving the Union.
I think that their stated reason may be that, but that doesn't mean it was their real reason. The South's stated reason and real reason was slavery. The North's stated reason was the preservation of the Union, but the real reason was slavery. And then
that was not the real reason.
Well,
that was absolutely not the real reason.
But I think that that's where neither of us were there. So I think that neither of us can officially know that. But
okay,
what we can do is we can look at what ended up happening afterwards. And what happened afterwards shows what their real goals were, in which ultimately they did free the slaves, which means that the overall goal was ultimately that.
Well, that contradicts the fact that the slaves in the Union states were not free.
Temporarily. That's just politics.
But if the goal is to free slaves,
you use political capital as if it means something more than it actually does.
Well, think about this. The Emancipation Proclamation was not designed to free slaves. You must know this. It specifically only freed the slaves in areas that they did not control. Like, it would be like just declaring it. I mean, you can't do that. You have to control the areas in which the slaves are being freed.
Sure, it was part of the overall look. We're strong. We're going to do what we need to. We're doing something important. We're making a big difference, and it was mostly rhetoric. I agree with that. But ultimately, what ended up happening was the freeing of the slaves. So sure, temporarily, I think that you're very focused on this short-term mentality of what, and honestly, I think it's just semantics. Because in the bigger picture, the overall point, both from the South and the North, was slavery. And
yeah, but that wasn't the immediate cause of the war. The immediate cause of the war was secession.
Immediate cause is different than primary cause. And
well, no,
this is where I think we're getting into semantics.
I really believe that had there been some other option to free the slaves, that the North would not have taken that. You know?
Well, I mean, to free the slaves, I don't know. But had there been some other reason for a state to secede, yeah, I absolutely believe that there would not necessarily have been military action. I've seen no reason to believe that in every single circumstance, a Union group would invade a state that was trying to secede. There's so much dissent on that actual issue, and there are a lot of people who believe they just had the right to just say, "Whoop, I'm walking out," and then walk out. So I see no reason that 100% of the time that a Union force would stop a state from seceding.
There wasn't a whole lot of dissent in the federal government, I can tell you that much.
I'm not following. When?
So the federal government's position has never changed on this issue. States aren't allowed to secede. They've never walked back from that ever. The federal government's always had the position that states can't secede, and they will take measures to prevent them from seceding for any reason, literally any reason. Like if you don't want to pay your taxes, you're getting invaded. If you don't want to pay a tariff, you're getting invaded. And not only do we have the nullification crisis as an example, we could just look to the Whiskey Rebellion too.
Okay, so I mean, you're an ANCAP. I respect that. I'm more of a minarchist myself, but both of us, I think, would agree that states ultimately should have had the right to secede. Whether they did or not, that's questionable. But I think that one thing that you do see when you look at the writings of the time is that a lot of people, like for instance Madison, and we talked about this earlier, some of the other founding fathers, all believed that states did have the right to secede if necessary. There were proposed amendments. No, this is true. There were proposed amendments to the Constitution to say that you do not have the right to secede. And those amendments never were actually passed because it was that they had the right to do so.
Do you know that was a minority view or not?
I mean, it depends. I don't believe it was a minority view, but I mean, it
was.
I mean, we'd have to look at that and everything, but
why do you suppose that amendment didn't make it in? Let's think about that for a minute.
Why didn't an amendment preventing states from seceding pass? Probably because it was accepted that states had a right to secede.
No, I thought you were saying that there was an amendment to prevent states from seceding.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. They were trying to pass constitutional amendments. Daniel Siskel and I think Henry someone or other had presented amendments that said states do not have the right to secede. And they never passed. Because it was accepted that states had the right to do so. That was still a minority view. If it was a minority view, why didn't it pass? I mean, I'm using your argument here. That was your argument.
Well, there's a lot of things that were never put into the Constitution because I guess a lot of people didn't want the Bill of Rights in there because they assumed that that we would just be limited to only those liberties. As it turns out, they were right.
That the Bill of Rights passed. The amendment to prevent states from seceding did not pass, whether when it was originally announced when Madison spoke against it, or later on near the Civil War, it also did not pass. So anyway, the point of that, the reason I think this is important is if it was something where the military action would always occur, then that would have been something where a constitutional amendment should have been passed to say this is completely wrong. We will advocate military action if you try and secede. But that amendment never went through, and we have no reason to believe that in 100% of the time, military action would have occurred on a state trying to secede. You've only presented one example of that, and it's just there's no reason.
But anyhow, like I said, views have changed over time. You know, right after the Revolutionary War, I'm sure secession was a more common view. It was still a minority view. But, you know, as the Union had existed for a long time, by the time the Civil War rolled around, that became an increasingly minority view. Even at the time of Jackson, it was pretty much, you know, he was a staunch Unionist. All historians agree on that. And, you know, the secession view did fall out of favor as the Revolutionary War became a distant memory. Then it became what is the political reality now? So now we have a union and we've had it for a long time, and we don't think that we should allow anyone to break it apart.
All right, let me make some final statements here, and then I'll let you go. But I think that ultimately the question here it comes down to what was the primary cause. And I think that both of us would agree that the immediate cause in the North was secession. But I would say that the primary cause in the North was still ultimately to prevent slavery. Certainly in the South, both the immediate and primary cause was the slavery. And if you look at the historical context, the fact that it was the election of Lincoln that led to these issues, that shows you that the primary focus of this war was because of slavery. Go ahead.
Okay, so the only thing I'll say is that it was in fact the majority view that preserving the Union was the cause of the war. There's loads of historical evidence to support that position. That's why everyone was fighting. That's why Congress was composed of the people that it was, and it was all about union.